Welcome back to Chess Dog. And today we have a game where it looks like world champion Magnus Carlsen might have met his match in Jan-Krzysztof Duda. This is a rapid game played at the Aim Chess Rapid. It's the knockout portion, and they're battling all the way up to first place here. So Duda and Carlsen. Duda has the white pieces. Carlsen has black. Let's jump right in. Jan-Krzysztof Duda begins with d4. Knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop to g7. So Carlsen plays the King's Indian defense, a rare guest at the top level these days. Used to be played all the time. It's an aggressive tactical opening. e4, d6, knight f3, castles, bishop to e2. The mainline classical system against the King's Indian defense. White builds these three pawns in the center. Black lets white do that, but then black is just going to attack this center with all of his might. Now, the main move here for black is e5. And after, say, castles, knight to c6, hits d4, d5, knight e7, and the battle lines would be drawn. Black would play on the king side with f5, white on the queen side with c5. But here Magnus plays a little bit unorthodox move. It's been seen before, but knight b to d7. He does not put immediate pressure on white's center. The one advantage of this move is it does avoid the exchange of queens. In the other line, white could force an exchange of queens if he wanted to. Now he cannot do that. After castles, e5, and bishop to e3. White doesn't have to play d5 because black isn't forcing Duda to do it. So he says, I'm just going to keep these pawns intact in the center. Rook to e8, threatening pawn takes pawn, and then knight takes e4 because the rook and the knight would both be attacking it. So white defends that pawn with queen to c2. h6, the idea is to keep the bishop out of g5. Carlsen wants to play knight to g4, hitting the bishop. And he doesn't want the bishop to go to g5, he wants it to retreat. Rook a to d1, knight to g4, and bishop to c1, just like Magnus was intending. And now c6, and this is the novelty of the game. Black does have a flexible structure. The queen could develop to b6 or a5. White could take on d4 and maybe play d5. But white does look better here. That is one thing I will say. But here, Duda decides to go ahead and play d5. Advance in the center, and Carlsen completely locks it up. So we get this locked center where pawn breaks will rule the day. Black wants to play f5, and it's very important to remember that as the game proceeds. A white's main pawn break will probably be b4. So, how does this game go? Well, g3 is the first move. Now, what Duda is trying to do, knowing that this f5 pawn break is black's main pawn break, he wants to do everything to control the f5 square. So he wants to play the knight to h4 to help control that square so that pawn break becomes very hard to execute. Knight to f8 allows the bishop to control f5, knight h4. Now h5, black would like to maybe play king h7, bishop h6. This bishop on g7 is a bad piece with all of these pawns blocking it. So he'd love to trade that off. f3 kicks the knight back. The knight goes back to h6. If it goes back to f6 here, it blocks the f-pawn, which is where black's counterplay comes from. So it goes to h6, bishop to e3, knight to h7, and now bishop to d3. Now look how Jan-Krzysztof Duda has done everything to prevent f5. The knight, the bishop, the queen, and the pawn all keep black from playing the natural pawn break in the position. The knight goes to g5, aiming at h3. Now king moves over because he's going to get hit with check, so he goes ahead and moves anyway. Knight moves to h3. Now, Magnus's knight on h3 looks dangerous, but he doesn't have a lot of helpers. He's sort of all by himself, but it's still a bit of a thorn in white's side. Duda plays a3. He now starts his main pawn break, which is the b4 advance. King to h7. Black wants to play knight g8, bishop h6 to trade off the dark squared bishop. b4, b6 to support the c5 pawn. Queen to d2. Now knight to g8. Bishop h6 is coming. So white plays rook to b1. The computers like this idea of bishop c2, bishop to a4, putting that bishop on a very active diagonal. But Duda wants to keep it aiming at the f5 square. So he plays rook to b1. So when pawn takes, he'll be in control of the open b file. Now bishop to h6, as we talked about, to trade off that bishop. Knight e2, bishop e3, queen takes e3. Now, Magnus has achieved an important strategic achievement. He's gotten rid of that very bad dark squared bishop and has almost equalized the position. Now here black plays knight to f6, and we just talked about how that blocks the f5 pawn. What Magnus seems to have come to the conclusion that f5 isn't going to be played, that white has successfully stopped it. So he decides on a different approach to his kingside attack, a unique and interesting way of attacking white's kingside. Rook to b1, potentially doubling on the b file when it opens. g5. So instead of f5, he plays the pawn to g5 and attacks with the g and h pawn. Now this knight goes back to g2. What if it hops into f5? Well, in that case, Magnus could take it. And after pawn takes bishop, e4 could be played. And after pawn takes knight to g4, and all of a sudden, these two knights are making white quite uncomfortable. So this is not a position he wants. So he retreats the knight to g2. King to g7 was played, maybe rook to g8. After the potential opening of the g file would have been stronger, but he plays king to g7, and now knight to g1. Duda wants to challenge Magnus' best placed piece, the knight at h3. He just wants to get that off of the board if possible. Magnus plays knight to h7, clearing f6 for his queen. And now Duda makes a very interesting decision. He realizes that although black is playing on the king side, black's king is less safe than white's king. So white decides to break on the king side as well. He plays f4 and turns the tables on Magnus. Magnus plays bishop to g4, and here Duda takes the knight on h3. It might have been better here to take on c5, then on e5, and after rook takes, play knight to f3, hitting that rook. Say after bishop f3, queen f3, then he'd be hitting the h5 and the f7 pawn. So not taking that knight might have been a slightly better decision, but he goes ahead and takes that knight. That was the intention of knight g1 anyway. Bishop takes h3, pawn takes, take with the b pawn. You don't take with the d pawn here. That would leave white with a protected passer, and this knight is nowhere near being able to blockade that pawn. That would be a terrible mistake. So he takes with the b pawn, opening up that b file. Now, rook f to b1 may have been the best idea here, but white takes on g5, and here Magnus has one move to equalize, and that move is queen takes g5. That would have kept the game on an equal footing. But instead, he decides to challenge the b file first, and that is a big mistake. Jan-Krzysztof Duda takes on b8. When the queen takes the rook, as it has to, white plays queen to f3 with a double attack on the f7 pawn with check and taking the pawn at h5. And in this position, Magnus resigned. Now let's look and see why. He could have played queen to b7, defending the f7 pawn, but after queen to h5, white's up 2 pawns with a much safer king, and there's not much reason to continue. He's threatening moves like queen to h6 and g6. It would be bad news. And if instead he plays rook to e7 to defend the f7 pawn, then queen h5, let's say bishop takes knight check, king takes bishop, queen b2, rook f2, queen to b3 attacking the bishop. Then white can execute the attack with queen to h6 check, king to g8, g6, pawn takes, queen g6, this is all forced, king to h8, queen to h6, threatening rook f8, rook to f8 mate, because the knight couldn't take, the knight was pinned. So the king has to come back, but then queen takes d6, and he counterattacks the black rook, and that would be it. So in this game, Magnus Carlsen met his match, and Jan-Krzysztof Duda won this game. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon.